Hello, my name's Liam. Before we dive into the DFAM, a quick mention. I've been building a platform called Orbit Music. It's where I put out sample and preset packs along with a couple of other artists whose work I really do admire. It's very techno-leaning, it's growing quickly, and I think that you'll find a lot there that pairs nicely with the DFAM and other pieces of gear like it. In fact, here is a free download link to some sounds from the DFAM that do sound tasty as fuck. That download link is also in the description of this video. And so let's dig into the DFAM drummer from another mother semi-modular analog percussion synthesizer. This is a drum machine, or a drum synth, maybe, if that's what you want to call it, that I've been curious about for years now, but I've never really gotten around to actually giving it a go. My first impression is that it's a super fun and unique sounding drum machine. It's quite limited, I would say, in its standalone use, but it's easy to break out of that, of course, because we have this whole modular section here, which makes this a semi-modular unit. Now, in my opinion, at least so far, the surface way, or like the standalone way of using the DFAM, is where it sounds tastiest. Like when you start sequencing it with something external, like the Oxy one, we're going to be doing that later in this video, the groove kind of changes and something kind of gets lost on me. Like, for example, I felt the same way about the Pulsar 23. The sequencer within the unit itself is very groovy, but once you start to add an external sequencer to that, again, something kind of just gets lost, in my opinion. That being said, the sequencer within the DFAM is just extremely simpler, right? It's just 8 steps. We could change the pitch per step. Let's just play something here, right? So let's tune this down to make it a little bit grittier. I always like to add a little bit of noise to my grooves, but yeah, like I said, pitch. So let's say if I want to tune all of this a bit higher, and then there's velocity as well per step. I've got 2 VCOs here as well, so if I just want one of them, so this becomes, I mean, it's atonal, but now it's a little bit more of a pitch. But with the second VCO going, I've got some FM amount going here, and that turns it into more of a percussive unit. Of course, depending on the decay as well, this will turn it into a percussive unit versus something that's a lot more open. Clearly, so many sweet spots on this unit. There's also noise. Let's bring that decay back down. It's just such a groovy unit, like it has such a groovy sequencer standalone. If during watching this video you're like, you know what, I would like to pick up the DFAM, consider using the purchase link in the description of this video. That's a great way of supporting. It doesn't cost you anything extra. Just wanted to point out as well, YouTube enrolled this thing called hyping. It's kind of like liking, but it carries a little bit more weight. So if you hype this video, that would be a huge help. I think another one of my personal favorite ways of using the DFAM is as like a top. So like sort of for hi-hats, if I blast the noise, include some noise here, I could play here to get a certain texture. The decay is like way down, right? So this could be a cool top thing. And then if I want like a little semblance of a melody or some sort of atonal thing going on there, I'm doing that through the VCO2. Even without the noise here, this still kind of sounds like a cool top if the decay is super low. Personally, I usually stick to the triangle wave as opposed to the square because it's a little bit more harsh. I like a more softer tone, especially in the high end right now. That's a sound, and the low end is equally as groovy. So if I turn the pitch of these down, right, so now this turns into a very low end thing. Let's find a sweet spot here. If I change the sequencer pitch mode to VCO2, in this case, we're getting a nice like pitter-pattery low end, which I really like as well. Again, with some noise to add grit to that. We can make this sound a little bit more like a drum right here. Sounds like a tom now, with a bit of noise, or a lot of noise perhaps. Right, so many sweet spots and textures to sort of dial in here. If I blast the FM amount on VCO2, Now we get into much more modular sounding territory. If I turn this to a square wave, it gets a lot harsher. So on its face, internally, that's some basic exploration of it. But again, super limited. Another limitation you may have noticed is the tempo knob here. So I can't select a specific tempo here. I'm sort of just, ballparking it, finding something I like, and then just going with it. And so that was the first step on how I leveled this thing up or made it a little bit more precise. I introduced an external sequencer, the Oxy1, to at least get a more specific tempo. So let's do that. And just like that, I have the Oxy1 here, which is set to 140 BPM. This is like my sweet spot BPM for the past little while. And what I've done here is I've patched one of the gate outs to the trigger input of the DFAM, and I also have two CV outs controlling VCO1 as well as VCO2. Let's see what the Oxy1 is unlocking here. So for example, this is a riff that I've come with using the matricial sequencer. By the way, if you want to know more about the matricial sequencer, here's a video on that. I've done a deep dive specifically on this. It's quite a complex sequencer, so you have a bunch of different parameters here that you could change. So for example, notes. Let's change the notes to something completely different. And we can sort of veto something until we like it. Okay. Let's tune this down though. So of course the step sequencer is a lot longer here. In this case, it's 32 steps. We can make this even longer if we want. Let's say 64 steps. So that's what, 8 times the length of the sequencer here. But again, it's not quite as groovy in my opinion. Let's add even more notes into here. Oh yes. So good. Another technique here, if you want even more low end, is actually to change this to a high pass, turn up the resonance a bunch, and then find that frequency, that bump, somewhere around there. So again, we're sounding a little bit more like a floor tom. A very dirty floor tom. If you want to get even crazier here, there's also a randomize function. We could add some re-triggers here. It just gets insane. There's also an octave. So this will go up the octave. We can also go down the octave, a certain percentage of the time. Right, so we're adding this to the beautiful sound of the DFAM, which is really cool. But that being said, it still doesn't quite have that internal DFAM sequencer qualities. So let's do a comparison. We just heard a bunch of riffs with the Oxy1. Let's actually just unplug this. See what it sounds like on its own again. There's just a certain grit to it. Okay, let's just play around with this a little bit though. Just instantly you come up with these really cool riffs. Change the pitch here, the velocity, very precise velocity points here. So for me, it just works really well for that sort of tribal synth, maybe even tribal techno sort of vibe. You can definitely incorporate it into that sort of setting. And so those are a couple of ways of using the DFAM, either with a sequencer or just internally. I find that both ways they sound great. This ended up being a short one. Thank you guys so much for being here and hope to see you in the next video.